And this week, Tony got beat worse than Batman would in a fight with Spider-Man. Anyway, moving on.
What'd you say?
Tony got beat really bad.
Like, that part I understood.
Yeah.
What's the rest of it?
Like Batman would in a fight with Superman. Everybody knows this.
Are you being serious right now?
Of course. I mean, Batman doesn't have superpowers. Spider-Man's got strength, webs.
But Batman fights supervillains all the time that have superpowers. On the reg, I believe.
Yeah, pussy-ass villains. I mean, let's be real. Spider-Man is taking shit up to another... I don't want to get in this argument again, okay?
I mean, say what you want about my fantasy team, but if you're going to talk about Batman right
fuck you and fuck Spider-Man. Get over here.
I'm going to kill you.
We told you earlier, Ramsey likes to talk. Does not even put his mouthpiece in on a lot of plays, so he is able to talk. And here they are. A.J. Green throwing punches.
It points in the back of Marcus Lattimore's net. Lattimore pushes it. Mike Evans comes flying out of the top rope.
See, the thing is I'm not blacked out drunk, so it's hard for me to argue this.
So we'll just let it keep escalating until one of us has an erection?
You are an out-of-shape, lazy piece of shit. He's got webs, he's got super strength, he can climb walls.
Hello.
Hello, Governor. Hello.
And now Reginald with the football news.
Did you chop say football?
I try to hold contempt for anyone that says vase instead of vase.
Okay, and Reginald, wrong sport.
Right.
I'll see myself out then. Welcome back to another episode of the Dual Threat Podcast. This will be episode 10 where we recap week 9's action. Let's start off with some waiver wire transactions that took place last week. So specifically, Tony's unfortunately timed trade of Drew Brees to myself. The deal involved parting ways with Drew Brees and a 2018 first-round pick, while I parted with Will Fuller, Evan Ingram, and a 2018 second-round pick. What seemed like moments later, Deshaun Watson tore his ACL in practice, goes down for the year, which resulted in Tony's immediate need for a quarterback, to which I happily facilitated in the form of sending Drew Brees back to Tony for a 2018 second and a 2018 fifth, as well as I received running back J.D. McKissick to make the money work. It was an unfortunate turn of events for Tony. What did you think of this whole mess, Nor?
Well, the word unfortunate is the best applicable word here for this entire situation. Watson's injury, I mean, it's been talked about a bunch since it happened, but just a really terrible series of events for that. For us to spend weeks talking about how, when's Tony going to make a move with one of his quarterbacks? I mean, he can't start both of them. What's he going to do? All of that leading up to him finally pulling the trigger in what seemed like a pretty good deal both ways, only to have to hit the reset button. And through your own magnanimous behavior, you were able to give him Drew Brees back. We'll see how this shakes out in terms of all the draft picks and all that stuff. I think that's going to be the real barometer for whether or not this trade was good one way or the other. But I don't know if I've ever seen this kind of a thing happen before where like a trade happens and there's immediate ramifications for it needing to be undone per se.
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth between Tony and I, and it's unfortunate that I wasn't a little more stubborn in his offers, because had I been, this would have all been avoided. But luckily, I get a first and a second out of it next year. I actually just hold on to my second, so I don't really gain a new one. But I got it back from Tony. That's that greedy SOB. So, yeah, again, unfortunate. I feel bad. I feel like I had a hand in this because I kept pushing for Tony to get rid of Deshaun Watson or Drew Brees, and he finally gets rid of one, and immediately he loses both. So, again, Tony, I think you made the right move, and I wouldn't be ashamed of what you did, but it blew up in your face. So, and I almost didn't trade Drew Brees back to Tony. If I told others, if Drew Brees' salary was less than $5, I would have held on to him just to spite Tony. So I think he would have had to roll with a mixture of Josh McCown and player X for the rest of the year at quarterback, which would have been hazardous for his health.
Josh McCown and the now like 3 or 4 New York Jets players that are on Tony's team. It's working on a stack there.
Very true, and they tore up my Bills defense this week.
Oh, man.
So we'll get to that later. Anyway, moving on. Lost in the shuffle, Tony also dumped Deshaun Watson to Ferralis for a 2018 fifth-round pick. What did you think of this move?
It was a little interesting, just in terms of, I didn't even think it was something Tony was considering for whatever reason. I thought, with having Deshaun Watson, you'd want to hang on to him. In all the back and forth with Breeze, with the trades we just talked about, he didn't end up extending Breeze, which I think he'd have every right to do, getting him back in a trade. So for him to not do that and also ship off Watson, I mean, I'm assuming it's just all hands on Andrew Luck next year for Tony, which is certainly not a bad consolation at all. But it'll be interesting to see if he'd rather just roll with Breeze again, try and get him back in the draft next year, and maybe even ship off Luck in a similar deal. But it was interesting. Deshaun Watson returns home to the team that originally drafted him during our snake draft with Ferals.
Yeah, completely agree. It was surprising to see Deshaun Watson get shipped out just for a 5th-round pick. Considering how much of a magnanimous start he had to this year. But you don't know when he's going to be back next year in 2018. You don't know if he's going to be the same player. We're coming back from a torn ACL. So we'll see. I think Ferales took a gamble here. He's got room on his roster, so we'll see how that pans out. Also, doing some housekeeping here, performed on Tuesday, arch nemesis Slater and Corey were somehow civil enough to pull off a trade in which Slater received Matt Ryan while Corey received Jameis Winston and a 2019 third-round pick. Your thoughts?
I mean, it's always weird when Slater and Corey end up making a deal. They've made more than one trade this year, which, still kind of blows my mind a little bit. But in this case, I think it's smart for Corey to dump a quarterback. He clearly is going to start Brady the rest of the way out. And for Slater, the quarterback revolving door, carousel, whatever you want to call it, continues. Hopefully, Matt Ryan can stay upright long enough to help him continue his little winning streak here.
Yeah, I think this is a spite move from Slater after 2 injury-riddled performances from Jameis Winston. Corey makes a good move here, picks up basically a free third-round pick. As you say, he's going to roll with Tom Brady the rest of the way. So I think it makes sense on both ends here. And now with the league transactions out of the way, let's move on to our matchup review section. Matchup 1, Kevin versus Areola. Man of the match. Greg Zuerlein once again came through in a big way for Kevin, scoring 17 fantasy points on kicks of 27, 46, and 47 yards to go along with 6 extra points. Greg the Leg has now scored 27, 2, 11, 17, and 17 fantasy points in his last 5 tilts and appears to be one of the top kicking options in the league. Biggest disappointment. It would be easy to go with the pathetic 1-point performance of Mike Evans against the New Orleans Saints, but my pick for disappointment is Julio Jones' 11-point fantasy outing, simply because it could have been so much more. I know Julio was limping for a portion of this game, but I saw live as Julio dropped a relatively easy over-the-shoulder bomb in the end zone for Matt Ryan that easily left 10 to 12 points on the field for the franchise player.
Oh man, the points that could have been for Julio. Not only did he have the massive drop that you talked about and Twitter exploded over, but I believe there was also a play earlier in the game where he had multiple steps on the corner and Matt Ryan sailed on the throw. So could have been even more than we're talking about for Julio. Definitely disappointing.
Agreed. You never go full Troy Williamson. Overall thoughts. It was an impressive showing from Kevin's team as he was all but left for dead last week. Impressive showings from Ted Ginn and Rashard Matthews really gave Kevin the boost he needed to overcome Mike this week. On the flip side, solid days from many of Mike's players made this competitive, but real dud performances from Mike Evans and the KC defense submarine Mike's chances in this one as he drops to 1-8, while Kevin climbs to 5-4. Matchup 2, Nor versus Tony. Man of the match. T.Y. Hilton is as much of a boom-bust player as you can find in fantasy football, and unfortunately for Tony, today was his biggest boom of the year as he finished with 5 catches for 175 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Houston Texans. Hilton has now 3 weeks of 17-plus fantasy points and 6 weeks of 4 or fewer fantasy points.
Yeah, as you touched on, normally I wouldn't consider Ty Hilton as this much of a boomer bust player, but I think with Jacoby Brissett, it's just the nature of the offense as it stands right now. The coaching staff came out and said they need to get him the ball, and what's funny about this is I don't even know if they actually got him the ball more. He just happened to be getting big play after big play. He only ended the game with 5 catches, so it wasn't like he had some 12 catch performance or something like that. But certainly good to see. Obviously, as you said, week to week, it's really hard to trust him. But because of these weeks, it's also really hard to bench him.
Do me a favor, Nor, and hold your fucking tongue about Jacoby Brisket, okay? You don't talk ill of the second coming, okay? He is Jesus reincarnate. Please keep his name out your mouth.
That's right. That's right. Tell that nigga.
Moving on. Biggest disappointment. Tony's entire skill position players really let him down here, save for recently acquired Evan Ingram. The combination of CJ Anderson, LaShawn McCoy, Will Fuller, Jordy Nelson netted Tony a combined 9 fantasy points. It seems like the core of his team has really crumbled due to injuries. He still boasts a talented roster, but the ceiling appears to be lowering every week. Overall thoughts. This is by far one of the strangest matchups of the year, as just before kickoff, North suffers 2 unforeseen setbacks as Zach Ertz was a scratch during warmups and Leonard Fournette was inactive due to violating team rules. Shortly after, AJ Green was ejected due to his brawl after the whistle with cornerback Jalen Ramsey. Despite these unusual speed bumps, Nor finds a way to put up 110 fantasy points and appears to be back in the good graces of the fantasy gods. Nor moves to 7-2 while Tony drops to 6-3.
And just to add to the weirdness of this matchup, I mean, to be playing against Tony in a week where he's got both AB and Jordan Howard on a bye, I was honestly hoping that there wouldn't need to be too many fireworks to get this win. But as you said, right before game time, things got real interesting. And then during the games, they got even more interesting. So it was definitely a weird week all around, and I'm just glad I could get back on the right track.
Matchup 3, Corey versus Sam. Man of the match. Corey Hart went into Monday Night Football, needing Marvin Jones to tie his second best scoring effort of the year to pick up the win. So what does Marvin Jones do? He has his best fantasy performance of the year with 22 points on 7 catches for 107 yards and 2 touchdowns. So once again, my opponent gets exactly what they need to beat me in humiliating fashion. The good news is, I'm not bitter. I'm not taking the loss well, and I'm now in no way contemplating suicide. So fantasy is fun, as it is rewarding. Moving on. Biggest disappointment. Devonta Freeman is falling deeper and deeper into the depths as he finished with just 5 fantasy points. After averaging just under 20 touches a game through his first 4 games, Freeman is now averaging just 13.25 touches and has failed to score a touchdown in his last 4 weeks. After performing like an RB1 in the beginning of the year, his must-start status is fading quickly. Overall thoughts. Corey once again beats me as this juggernaut needs neither Brady nor Gronk to make me his little bitch boy. It was good to see Hopkins perform without Watson under center, but Corey has to be concerned about his running back core performance as Doug Martin and Matt Breida combined for 1 fantasy point. Corey collects another free win from me and moves to 7-2 on the year while I slip into the abyss at 4-5. Matchup 4, Jason versus Ferralis. Man of the match. Dak Prescott did his best to overcome Mike's poor overall team performance. Dak finished 21 of 33 for 249 yards and 2 touchdowns and no interceptions to go along with 27 yards and a rushing touchdown on the ground. Dak finished with 25 fantasy points. He was impressive against a porous KC defense and remains a consistent fantasy performer as he has now scored 22 plus fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games.
He lost.
Biggest disappointment. Aaron Jones appears to be just as unpredictable as the rest of the Green Bay offense without Aaron Rodgers under center. He finished with just 5 carries for 12 yards and 1 fantasy point. It will be difficult to trust him moving forward and really hurt Mike in this difficult matchup. Overall thoughts. Mike's up and down season continues as he put up a combined 68 fantasy points. It appears his team's scoring will be very volatile, and hopefully he can have enough up weeks moving forward to secure a playoff position. Jason had an overall solid week, no standouts as his highest scorer had just 12 fantasy points, but it was a solid effort from his entire roster, and it provided a much needed win for JB behind the glass as both teams moved to 4-5 on the season.
Yeah, it was good to see old JB back there get a win as opposed to the close gut punches that he's been dealing with this year. Like you said, a consistent scoring output from his team. It told the tale. My thing about this matchup is it just amazes me every year how quickly players can go from like, oh, must start, you got to start him, to and they're like one of the hottest players at their position potentially in the league, to, oh, I don't even know like if I can start them next week. This whole Aaron Jones situation just brings it to light. It's like he looked like a guy you got to play every week, almost regardless of matchup, just because you knew they were going to lean on the run. But then he has a dud week, and now, you don't know going forward. So it's just fantasy in a nutshell, but it always surprises me.
Speaking of many seasons within a season, matchup 5, Gomez versus Slater. Man of the match, Alvin Kamara totaled 16 touches for 152 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Saints' blowout win against the floundering Bucks. Kamara finished with 24 fantasy points, which proved to be more than the difference in this matchup with Gomez. Biggest disappointment. DeMarco Murray really struggled against the Baltimore Ravens as he finished with 11 total touches for 41 yards and 3 fantasy points. Murray was in and out of the lineup with an injury, but finished the game. It has to be hard to trust Murray as he has scored 6 or fewer points in 4 of his last 5 games. It appears the early season trade for Murray was less attractive than initially thought. Overall thoughts. Don't look now, but Slater is pulling himself back into the playoff race as he is now just 1 game back of the pack. Also, this move really distances himself from Areola in the race to escape Beer Bitch. An important win here for Slate. Also a crushing loss for Gomez as he's now dropped 2 in a row and could see his chances at a return to the playoffs fading. Gomez now sits at 4-5, while Slater moves to 3-6. Best start of the week.
Whoa, it's time for Sam's best start of the week.
Last week we talked about how devoid of talent Kevin's roster was. So what does he do? Adds and starts Rashard Matthews and Ted Ginn, and they reward him with a combined 23 fantasy points. Kevin's lack of star power really aids in this talent of playing the matchups, and he played them beautifully in the starts of Matthews and Ginn. Worst start of the week.
Why is everyone so fucking stupid?
Not that it cost him, but Corey performs another victory lap against me by starting San Francisco running back Matt Breida, who finished with just 1 fantasy point and didn't score the point until starter Carlos Hyde was ejected from the game. Terrible start as predicted, as Breida has scored more than 3 fantasy points in just 2 games this season. But hey, why start good players when you're playing against me? Moving on to our matchup preview section. Nor, what's a matchup next week that you're looking forward to?
There are a lot of good matchups that caught my eye when I was taking a peek at next week's schedule, but I got to go with our very own JB behind the glass versus one Corey of House Tall guy. I know most of us are beyond tired of the ongoing saga with Zeke. Suspended, not suspended, playing, not playing, abusive, not abusive, whatever you want to break it down as. But yet again, anytime that there's a matchup with Corey, that decision or non-decision is going to have huge ramifications. In this particular week, if Zeke is actually popped for a suspension, finally, it'll set the stage for JB to start Alfred Morris against Corey and potentially be able to steal a big win here. We've talked about Corey's running back situation. Obviously, his team has been able to roll pretty well in most of his matchups, but it's still very top-heavy. Tom, Gronk, Zeke, those are cornerstones, and they're very good when they're all there. Take one of them away, and we'll just have to see how it rolls out for Corey.
All right, the matchup that I'm looking forward to next week is my matchup against one Kevin Michelle Wallen. Despite how our teams are playing, this is my Super Bowl. My Game 7, my championship game. I couldn't be more hyped for this matchup, as the winner of this match could really alter the landscape of the playoff picture.
You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Touching on that, I mean, the amount of teams that are 4-5 right now, or a game out from that, is really awesome, and it just shows the parity that we've got in the league, and if nothing else, it's going to make for a really amazing last couple games down the stretch before we really start to lock in for who's in, who's out on the playoffs.
Slater slanders. Slater slanders.
Sorry, gentlemen. I begged, I pleaded, but there will be no Slater slander.
All right, thanks, Slate. Appreciate you taking time out of that high top fade to send us some love with a Slater slander.
Bzzz.
All right, we're going to move on to a new segment this week where we take an instance from each of the past week's matchups and decide whether these instances are spare or fair. Are you ready, Nora?
Yes, of course, this segment had to follow Slater's segment because I think he's the brainchild here.
All right, let's start with matchup 1, Tony versus Areola. How about Mike Evans scoring 1 fantasy point against the New Orleans defense? Spare or fair?
So at first glance, when I was thinking about this, I really was leaning towards spare. But I pulled a little M. Night Shyamalan twist.
What a twist!
And I'm calling this fair. And there's only one reason why. This could have easily been a better outing if Mike Evans didn't lose his entire mind and try to attack Marshawn Lattimore. Maybe he gets some garbage points here or there. Maybe he just gets a couple catches. You don't know what it could end up being. But the 1-point outing, I think, is directly his fault, for lack of a better term.
Okay, moving on to Tony in your matchup. How about LaShawn McCoy getting just 25 yards on a season-low 12 carries and no catches against the New York Jets? Spare or fair?
I mean, despite the juicy opportunity to call this fair and probably make Tony pop a blood vessel, I decided to go with this as a spare. This type of outing from Shady was not seen. No one saw this coming, whether it was fantasy analysts all across the networks or just, looking at his own lineup thinking, oh, no, I'm going to bench Shady against the Jets because that's what I should be worried about. So this one had spare written all over it.
All right, how about matchup 3, myself against Corey in that same Jets-Buffalo game? The Buffalo's defense getting -1 fantasy points against the Jets. They had been averaging 12 fantasy points a week prior to last Thursday. Spare or fair?
I'm going to call this one spare as well. The Thursday night matchups have continued to be just atrocious in terms of one side of the matchup completely dominating the other. I think just everyone was expecting it to be Buffalo that ended up doing the dominating here. But for the Jets to come out and play the way they did, obviously, good on them. But it would have been one thing if the Bills got, a 3 or a 5 or something relatively disappointing, but still somewhat helpful. A -1 is that's crazy. I don't even know how many starting defenses have got negative points on the year this year. So that's spare to me.
Well, it's happened to me twice. Moving on, matchup 4, Jason versus Ferralis. We've got Sammy Watkins coming down with his 1 and only reception of his 2 total targets. But that 1 reception was being a 67-yard touchdown. Is that reception spare or fair?
So I'm sure I'm going to catch some heat from this one from, some of the guys that really understand the true essence of spare in the league. Slater, Kevin, maybe a couple others primarily. But this exact situation is probably what spare was designed to represent. But I'm calling it fair, and here's why. Sammy Watkins was absolutely due for some part of this action that was going on against the Giants. The ball's getting thrown all over the yard. Everyone's getting involved. Tight ends that are catching touchdowns that have barely seen the field. Robert Woods is going full ham sandwich on people. Watkins had to get involved at some point in this barrage of points. Also, if you look at Watkins' career so far, he's always been a second half of the year performer in terms of fantasy output. So, I don't know. I felt like this one wasn't as surprising to me.
Okay, finally, Alvin Kamara's 24-point performance for Slater against Gomez. Obviously his best outing of the year. Is this performance spare or fair?
I'm calling this one fair. And the reasoning behind it is, since the trade of AP, the backfield in New Orleans is completely crystallized in terms of not just usage of when they're using Mark Ingram versus when they're using Kamara, but touches and everything like that is all leveled out. Kamara's numbers since the trade, he's been able to put up some pedestrian numbers, but the thing you'll notice is that he's continually trending upwards. So 8, 10, 12, 24. The touches are relatively staying the same, but he's putting out a better output each week. I think he's just getting into his groove in that offense. So this seems like fair to me.
All right, and that was our first installment of the new segment, Spare or Fair. Thanks, Nora. Appreciate that breakdown. Let's move on to our final segment, what everyone is savoring for and clamoring for every week, the weekly power rankings. Number 10, Mike Arriola, 1 and 8. Alarms have to be sounding now as Mike drops his 8th of the season. Once again, his opponent scores 100 or more points, but Mike seems incapable of answering back on a consistent basis with this group of volatile producers. Number 9, Alex Gomez, 4 and 5. Another dud week for Gomez, and even with 15 points from the Jags defense. Funches performed well as the new number 1 for the Panthers, but the rest of his team struggled to produce yardage, let alone touchdowns. Number 8, Alex Slater, 3 and 6. An impressive showing from Alvin Kamara overcame Jameis's early exit. The team seems to be rounding into form with the additions of Kamara and Kelsey. We'll see if they can produce at this consistent level. Number 7, Kevin Wallen, 5 and 4. A bump up in the standings here as Kevin could be boosted by his 2 new wide receiver additions. Adrian Peterson won't play the 49ers each week or see 37 carries, but it was an impressive call to arms for Kevin, who was really on a downturn in recent weeks. Number 6, Sam Nix, 4 and 5. Right in the line of mediocrity, this team isn't performing well, but a -1 from Buffalo's defense didn't help. As long as my players can stay out of the negative, solid performances should be forthcoming. Number 5, Michael Ferralis, 4 and 5. A tough loss in Week 9 against Jason, but without Jerick McKinnon and Le'Veon Bell, hard to judge this team too harshly. I expect a bounce back in Week 10. Number 4, Jason Bercease, 4 and 5. This was a tough decision, as most teams between 4 and 8 are very similar, but Jason's team performed well in Week 9, and there's something to be said about the solid nature in which his team produced. Number 3, Tony Funston, 6 and 3. A poor performance in Week 9 doesn't move Tony from the number 3 spot here, as many teams perform poorly. His running back depth took a hit without Jordan Howard, but it appears to be the lack of depth overall that is catching up with Tony. Number 2, Noor Sandu, 7 and 2. Technically in first place due to a points tiebreaker, Noor had an impressive return to form in Week 9 without a single fantasy point from A.J. Green or Leonard Fournette. Noor continues to score in the hundreds and is looking to lock up the number 1 seed.
Okay!
And number 1, back-to-back weeks, we have Corey Hart, 7 and 2. Corey continues to rack up the victories as he now has 6 in a row. His team has won in a variety of fashions and seems to be impervious to any missing players, poor performances, etc. Nor any instant feedback on this week's power rankings.
Yeah, the first thing that jumps out is, I know that, Kevin's performance has been up and down, especially with the skid more recently. Last week, obviously, getting back on the winning side of things, but that skid is a large proponent of why he has 4 losses. I think prior to that, he was cruising, and we weren't even sure why, but he was still making it happen. So I think he could be a little bit higher in these rankings. Maybe a sweet spot would be right above the 4 and 5 logjam that you have with all the teams that are 4 and 5. And my biggest thing is this many teams at 4 and 5, or just a game out like Slater sitting at 3 and 6, is going to make this stretch run really, really awesome. So I'd move Kevin. I don't know necessarily who you bump down for that, but I think he should be a little higher.
You said 4 and 5 a lot there, Nor.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something. You think you're better than me? Blue cheese. You do think you're better than me. Holy aioli. All right. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Dual Threat Podcast, the official companion piece to the Gridiron Gala. I've been your host, Sam, here with my co-host, Nor, and JB behind the glass. Thank you for joining us for another exciting episode, and we'll see you same time next week.
Adios!